The Euler-Einstein equation. That's what we called it at first, in those early days when we still believed we were on the cusp of something revolutionary. How naive we were, how arrogant. My name is Dr. Heinrich Weiss, and I was part of the team tasked with deciphering Albert Einstein's final formula. Found among his personal papers after his death, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. The handwriting was frantic, almost manic, as if Einstein had been racing against time itself to get the information down. At first glance, it appeared to be a variation on his famous E equals mc squared formula, E equals mc squared plus the integral from 0 to infinity of psi of x dx. But that integral, it was something entirely new. Psi of x represented a function we couldn't identify, stretching to infinity. It hinted at energies and dimensions beyond our current understanding. Our team was assembled from the brightest minds across various disciplines: theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, cosmology, and even a few mathematicians specializing in abstract algebra. We were given a secure facility, cut off from the outside world, to focus solely on cracking this enigma. The first few weeks were exhilarating. We'd spend hours poring over Einstein's notes, trying to decipher his shorthand, debating the potential implications of each symbol. Dr. Carlin, our quantum mechanics expert, was convinced the formula was a key to unlocking the secrets of dark energy. Professor Istvan, on the other hand, believed it might be the long-sought theory of everything, unifying all fundamental forces. But something about Einstein's notes always felt off. There was a darkness to them, an underlying desperation that we couldn't quite explain. His equations were littered with strange symbols, ones we couldn't trace back to any known mathematical system. They looked almost like sigils, arcane and ancient, as if Einstein had been communicating with something not of this world. I remember the day we made our first breakthrough. It was 3 a.m., and I'd been staring at the equation for so long, the symbols were starting to swim before my eyes. That's when I noticed something odd about the integral. The integral from 0 to infinity of psi of x dx. The limits of integration, they weren't just representing mathematical infinity. Somehow, and I still can't explain how I knew this, they were pointing to actual physical infinity. Not just the concept, but a tangible, accessible realm beyond our universe. Excited, I called the team together. We spent the next 72 hours in a frenzy of calculations and theories. We derived a set of partial differential equations that we believed could model the behavior of psi of x. The partial derivative squared of psi with respect to time squared minus c squared times the Laplacian of psi plus m squared times c to the fourth times psi equals 0. This looked suspiciously like the Klein-Gordon equation, but with additional terms that hinted at extra dimensions. We were ecstatic. This could be the key to understanding the very fabric of reality itself. But then things started to get strange. It began with Dr. Carlin. He'd always been a bit high-strung, but one morning he came into the lab looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room as if searching for something. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The humming, it's in everything." We dismissed it as stress and lack of sleep. But then others started reporting similar experiences. A low, almost subsonic vibration that seemed to permeate everything. At first I couldn't hear it. But then late one night, as I was working through some particularly complex calculations, I felt it. It wasn't so much a sound as a feeling, a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to measure it, setting up sensitive audio equipment throughout the lab. The readings we got back were unsettling. The frequency was precisely 432 Hertz, which might not seem significant until you realize that this is a harmonic of the Schumann resonance, the natural frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic field. But there was something else, a pattern hidden within the vibration. When we ran it through a spectrogram, we saw this. A complex waveform appears, its peaks and troughs forming a pattern that looks disturbingly like the original Einstein equation. This was impossible. Sound waves don't behave like this. It was as if the equation itself was trying to manifest in our reality. Things escalated quickly after that. Team members started reporting vivid, terrifying dreams. They all described the same thing: an infinite void where the laws of physics broke down. In this space, they saw things, entities that defied description, their geometries so alien and complex that looking at them caused physical pain. It was around this time that Dr. Istvan brought up a disturbing theory. He'd been delving into Einstein's life, trying to understand the context in which these equations were developed. And what he found terrified us. Einstein was desperate, Istvan said one night, his voice strained. He'd been trying to reconcile relativity with quantum mechanics for decades. The closer he got, the more he realized that the two were fundamentally incompatible. It drove him to the brink of madness. He showed us letters, correspondences between Einstein and some of his closest confidants. In them, Einstein spoke of his growing frustration, his fear that he would die without ever finding the unifying theory he sought. But there was one letter in particular that stood out. It was addressed to an unknown recipient, someone Einstein referred to only as the benefactor. In this letter, Einstein mentioned a bargain, a pact he had made in the dead of night under circumstances he refused to describe in detail. He spoke of knowledge beyond human comprehension, of equations that would unlock the secrets of the universe, but at a terrible cost. The letter ended with a chilling line: "The door has been opened, and I fear what I have unleashed." "You're not suggesting," I began, but Istvan cut me off. "A Faustian bargain," he whispered. "What if Einstein made a deal with something not of this world? What if this equation is the result of that deal? A key, yes, but also a curse?" We all laughed it off at first. It was too ridiculous, too outlandish. But the more we thought about it, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. Einstein had been grappling with forces beyond his understanding, forces that might have driven him to seek out help from something else. I began to notice other things in Einstein's notes, things that had seemed insignificant at first, but now took on a more sinister meaning. Strange symbols drawn in the margins, almost like occult runes, references to ancient texts, ones that predated modern science by centuries. And always that same equation, E equals mc squared plus the integral from 0 to infinity of psi of x dx. I started to realize that psi of x wasn't just a function. It was a wave function describing the probability distribution of something that existed beyond the boundaries of our universe. Something that Einstein had somehow made contact with. As I delved deeper into the mathematics, I began to formulate a terrifying hypothesis. What if our universe wasn't the only one? What if there were infinite universes all stacked together like pages in a book? And what if Einstein's equation was a key to turning those pages? I derived a new set of equations building on this idea. Capital Psi equals the sum over n of c sub n times psi sub n, where capital Psi represented the total wave function of all possible universes, and psi sub n represented the wave function of each individual universe. The coefficient c sub n determined the probability of each universe's state. But as I worked through the implications of this, I realized something that chilled me to my core. By observing and interacting with this equation, we weren't just passive observers. We were actively collapsing the wave function, forcing it into a specific state. And in doing so, we were drawing the attention of whatever lay beyond. The incidents escalated. Team members reported seeing their doppelgangers, exact copies of themselves that would appear for a split second before vanishing. Objects would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. And the humming, that incessant vibration, grew louder with each passing day. I tried to convince the others that we needed to stop, to destroy our work before it was too late, but they wouldn't listen. They were too far gone, too consumed by the equation and the promise of ultimate knowledge it held. The atmosphere in the lab had grown thick with an unspoken tension, a quiet dread that settled into the corners of our minds and weighed down every thought. The endless hum of the unknown frequency was no longer just a background noise. It had become an almost living presence, a constant reminder that something was terribly, horribly wrong. We were all there, gathered around the central table where Einstein's final papers were spread out, each of us lost in our own frantic calculations, desperate to find meaning in the chaos. It was Dr. Carlin who noticed it first, the yellow envelope tucked away under a stack of diagrams, as if someone had tried to hide it. "What's that?" he muttered, his voice tight with suspicion. He reached for it with clammy hands, the envelope's aged paper crackling as he lifted it from the pile. The rest of us paused, our eyes drawn to the object, as if it held some dark secret we weren't sure we wanted to uncover. "Looks old," I said, barely above a whisper. "But why hide it?" Carlin glanced around, his gaze meeting each of ours as if seeking permission. With a nod, he tore open the envelope, the yellowed paper giving way to reveal its contents. Inside was a single crumpled sheet, the edges stained with age and something darker, something that looked almost like rust. But it wasn't rust. With a sharp intake of breath, Carlin unfolded the paper, and that's when we saw it. The words scrawled in a frenzied, uneven hand, smeared and half-faded, but unmistakably written in blood. "God does not exist. The devil told me so." For a moment, the room was silent, each of us frozen in place, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. It was Dr. Istvan who broke the silence, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. Is this Einstein's handwriting?" None of us could answer. The handwriting was erratic, almost unrecognizable compared to the meticulous script we'd been studying for weeks. But the sheer panic in the strokes, the desperation that bled through each letter, there was no mistaking the genius behind it. This was Einstein's writing, but it was a side of him we had never imagined. How could this be here?" I stammered, my heart racing. "We've gone through all of his notes. We never found anything like this." Carlin shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This wasn't meant to be found," he said, his voice cracking. "This was hidden." We stared at the note, the words burning into our minds, etching themselves into our memories. There was something primal, something deeply wrong about the message. It was as if Einstein, in his final moments, had reached a horrifying conclusion, one that had driven him to the brink of insanity. He made contact with something," Istvan murmured, his voice shaking. "Something beyond our comprehension. And it told him." "The devil," Carlin said, his voice hollow. Einstein spoke to the devil. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if the words themselves had summoned a darkness we could not escape. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a creeping dread crawling up my spine. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if the very air around us was alive with malevolence. "We need to stop," I said, my voice raspy. "We need to stop this now. Destroy everything before." "Before what?" "Before we found out if Einstein's message was true. Before we met the same fate as him." But it was too late. We had gone too far, opened a door that could never be closed. And now we were staring into the abyss, where reason and faith had no place, where even the greatest mind in history had found only despair. Istvan snatched the note from Carlin's hands, his eyes wide with a manic intensity. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, we need to know. We need to see what he saw." "Istvop!" I shouted, but he was already moving, his hands flying across the chalkboard, scribbling equations, connecting dots that weren't meant to be connected. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, the air itself vibrating with the force of whatever was trying to break through. And then it hit me, the realization that sent a wave of nausea crashing through my body. We were never meant to understand this. This knowledge, this equation, it wasn't a gift. It was a curse, a test of our hubris, and we had failed. Because in that moment I understood the truth that Einstein had learned too late. The devil doesn't bargain. The devil deceives, seduces, and ultimately destroys. And now we were standing on the precipice of something far worse than we could ever imagine. As the vibrations reached a fever pitch, as the walls of reality itself seemed to buckle and strain, I saw it, just for an instant, a shadow moving in the corner of my vision, a shape that didn't belong in our world. A figure that smiled with a darkness that consumed everything in its wake. God does not exist. The words echoed in my mind as the light flickered and dimmed, as the room was swallowed by the void. And in that darkness, I knew we had unleashed something far more terrible than the devil himself. The devil told me so. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a whisper, so soft it could have been a thought, or perhaps the very voice that had spoken to Einstein in his final moments. Welcome to the truth. And that truth? E is not equal to mc squared. E is not real. There never was a God to declare light. It was always a formless void of darkness covered the face of the deep. There only ever was darkness, but a fading consciousness in a dead universe.